This is Camus, The Plague, Part 4, Chapter 2. During the first part of September, Rambert had worked conscientiously at Ria's side. He had merely asked for a few hours' leave on the day he was due to meet Gonzales and the two youngsters outside the boys' school. Gonzales kept the appointment, and while he and the journalist were talking, they saw the two boys coming towards them laughing. They said they'd had no luck last time, but that was only to be expected. Anyhow, it wasn't their turn for sentry go this week. Rambert must have patience till next week. Then they'd have another shot at it. Rambert observed that patience certainly was needed in this business. Gonzales suggested they should all meet again on the following Monday, and this time Rambert had better move in to stay with Marcel and Louis. "We'll make a date, you and I. If I don't turn up, go straight to their place. I'll give you the address." But Marcel or Louis told him that the safest thing was to take his pal there right away. Then he'd be sure of finding it. If he wasn't too particular, there was enough grub for the four of them. That way he'd get the hang of things like. Gonzales agreed it was a good idea, and the four of them set off towards the harbor. Marcel and Louis lived on the outskirts of the dockyard, near the gate giving on the cliff road. It was a small Spanish house with gaily painted shutters and bare, dark rooms. The boy's mother, a wrinkled old Spanish woman with a smiling face, produced a dish of which the chief ingredient was rice. Gonzales showed surprise, as rice had been unprocurable for some time in the town. "We fix it up at the gate," Marcel explained. Rambert ate and drank heartily, and Gonzales informed him he was a damn good sort. Actually, the journalist was thinking solely of the coming week. It turned out that he had a fortnight to wait, as the periods of sentry duty were extended to 2 weeks, to reduce the number of shifts. During that fortnight, Rambert worked indefatigably, getting every ounce out of himself, with his eyes shut, as it were, from dawn till night. He went to bed very late, and always slept like a log. This abrupt transition from a life of idleness to one of constant work had left him almost void of thoughts or energy. He talked little about his impending escape. Only one incident is worth noting. After a week, he confessed to the doctor that for the first time he'd got really drunk. It was the evening before. On leaving the bar, he had an impression that his groin was swollen, and he had pains in his armpits when he moved his arms. "I'm for it," he thought. And his only reaction, an absurd one as he frankly admitted to Ria, had been to start running to the upper town, and when he had reached a small square, from which, if not the sea, a fairly big patch of open sky could be seen, to call to his wife, with a great cry, over the walls of the town. On returning home and failing to discover any symptoms of plague on his body, he had left far from proud of having given way like that. Ria, however, had said he would well understand one's being moved to act thus. Or anyhow, one may easily feel inclined that way. "Monsieur Othon was talking to me about you this morning," Ria suddenly remarked, when Rambert was bidding him good night. "He asked me if I knew you, and I told him I did. Then he said, if he's a friend of yours, advise him not to associate with smugglers. It's bound to attract attention." "Meaning what?" "Means you better hurry up." "Thanks." Rambert shook the doctor's hands. In the doorway he suddenly swung round. Ria noticed that for the first time since the outbreak of plague, he was smiling. "Why don't you stop my going? You could easily manage it." Ria shook his head with his usual deliberateness. It was none of his business, he said. Rambert had elected for happiness, and he, Ria, had no argument to put up against him. Personally, he felt incapable of deciding which was the right course and which the wrong one in such a case as Rambert's. "If that's so, why tell me to hurry up?" It was Ria who now smiled. "Perhaps because I too would like to do my bit for happiness." Next day, though they were working together most of the time, neither referred to the subject. On the following Sunday, Rambert moved into the little Spanish house. He was given a bed in the living room. As the brothers did not come home for meals, and he'd been told to go out as little as possible, he was always alone, but for occasional meetings with the boy's mother. She was a dried-up little wisp of a woman, always dressed in black, busy as a bee, and had a nut-brown, wrinkled face and immaculately white hair. No great talker. She merely smiled generally when her eyes fell on Rambert. She merely smiled genially when her eyes fell on Rambert. On one of the few occasions when she spoke, it was to ask him if he wasn't afraid of infecting his wife with the plague. He replied that there might be some risk of that, but only a very slight one, while if he stayed in the town there was a fair chance of their never seeing each other again. The old woman smiled. Is she nice? Very nice. Pretty? I think so. Ah, she nodded. That explains it. She went to Mass every morning. Don't you believe in God? She asked him one morning on her return. On Rambert's admitting he did not, she said again that explained it. Yes, she added, you're right, you must go back to her, or else what would be left to you? Rambert spent most of the day prowling round the room, gazing vaguely at the distempered walls, idly fingering the fans which were their only decoration, or counting the woolen balls on the tablecloth fringe. In the evening the youngsters came home. They hadn't much to say except that the time hadn't come yet. After dinner, Marcel played the guitar, and they drank an anise-flavored liqueur. Rambert seemed lost in thought. On Wednesday, Marcel announced, it's for tomorrow night, at midnight. Mind you're ready on time. Of the two men sharing the sentry post with them, he explained, one had got plague, and the other, who had slept in the same room, was now under observation. Thus, for 2 or 3 days, Marcel and Louis would be alone at the post. They'd fix up the final details in the course of the night, and he could count on them to see it through. Rambert thanked them. Pleased? The old woman asked. He said yes, but his thoughts were elsewhere. The next day was very hot and muggy, and a heat mist veiled the sun. The total of deaths had jumped up, but the old Spanish woman lost nothing of her serenity. There's so much wickedness in the world, she said, so what can you expect? Like Marcel and Louis, Rambert was stripped to the waist, but even so, sweat was trickling down his chest and between his shoulder blades. In the dim light of the shuttered room, their torsos glowed like highly polished mahogany. Rambert kept prowling around like a caged animal without speaking. Abruptly, at 4 in the afternoon, he announced that he was going out. Don't forget, Marcel said, at midnight sharp. Everything's set. Rambert went to the doctor's flat. Ria's mother told him he would find the doctor at the hospital in the upper town. As before, a crowd was circling in front of the entrance gates. Move on there! A police sergeant with bulging eyes bawled every few minutes, and the crowd kept moving, but always in a circle. No use hanging round here. Why don't you go home? The sergeant's coat was soaked in sweat. They knew it was no use, but they stayed on, despite the devastating heat. Rambert showed his pass to the sergeant, who told him to go to Tarrou's office. Its door gave onto the courtyard. He passed Father Panelou, who was coming out of the office. Tarrou was sitting at a black wood desk, with his sleeves rolled up, mopping up with his handkerchief a trickle of sweat in the bend of his arm. The office, a small white painted room, smelt of drugs and damp cloth. Still here? Tarrou seemed surprised. Yes, I'd like to have a word with Ria. He's in the ward. Look here, don't you think you could fix up whatever you're coming for without seeing him? Why? He's overdoing it. I try to spare him as much as I can. Rambert gazed thoughtfully at Tarrou. He'd grown thinner. His eyes and features were blurred with fatigue. His broad shoulders sagged. There was a knock at the door. A male attendant wearing a white mask entered. He laid a little sheaf of cards on Tarrou's desk, and his voice, coming thickly through the cloth, said, 6, then went out. Tarrou looked at the journalist and showed him the cards, spreading them fanwise. Neat little gadgets, aren't they? Well, they're deaths, last night's takings. Frowning, he slipped the cards together. The only thing that's left us is accountancy. Taking his purchase on the table, Tarrou rose slowly to his feet. You're off quite soon, I take it? Tonight, at midnight. Tarrou said he was glad to hear it, and Rambert had better look after himself for a bit. Did you say that sincerely? Tarrou shrugged his shoulders. At my age, one's got to be sincere. Lying's too much effort. Excuse me, Tarou, the journalist said, but I'd greatly like to see the doctor. I know. He's more human than I. All right, come on. It's not that. Rambert stumbled over his words and broke off in mid-phrase. Tarou stared at him, then unexpectedly his face broke into a smile. They walked down a narrow passage. The walls were painted pale green and the light was glaucous like that of in an aquarium. Before they reached the two-leaved glazed door at the end of the passage, behind which shadowy forms could be seen moving, Tarou took Rambert into a small room, all the wall space of which was occupied by cupboards. Opening one of these, he took from a sterilizer 2 masks of cotton wool enclosed in muslin, handed one to Rambert, and told him to put it on. The journalist asked if it was really any use. Tarou said no, but it inspired confidence in others. They opened the glazed door. It led into an enormous room, all the windows of which were shut in spite of the great heat. Electric fans buzzed near the ceiling, churning up the stagnant, overheated air above 2 long rows of gray beds. Groans, shrill or stifled, rose on all sides, blending in a monotonous dirge-like refrain. Men in white moved slowly from bed to bed under the garish light flooding in from high, barred windows. The appalling heat in the ward made Rambert ill at ease, and he had difficulty in recognizing Rieux, who was bending over a groaning form. The doctor was lancing the patient's groin, while 2 nurses, one on each side, held his legs apart. Presently Rieux straightened up, dropped his instruments into a tray that an attendant held out to him, and remained without moving for some moments, gazing down at the man whose wound was now being dressed. Any news? He asked Tarou, who had come beside him. Paneloux is prepared to replace Rambert at the quarantine station. He has put in a lot of useful work already. All that remains is to reorganize number 3 group, now that Rambert's going. Rieux nodded. Castel has his first lot of the vaccine ready now, Tarou continued. He's in favor of its being tried at once. Good, Rieux said. That's good news. And Rambert's come. Rieux looked around. His eyes narrowed above the mask when he saw the journalist. Why have you come? He asked. Surely you should be elsewhere. Tarou explained that it was fixed for midnight, to which Rambert added, That's the idea, anyhow. Whenever any of them spoke through the mask, the muslin bulged and grew moist over the lips. This gave a sort of unreality to the conversation. It was like a colloquy of statues. I'd like to have a word with you, Rambert said. Right, I'm just going. Wait for me in Tarou's office. A minute or so later, Rambert and Rieux were sitting at the back of the doctor's car. Tarou, who was at the wheel, looked round as he let in the gear. Petrol's running out, he said. We'll have to foot-slog it tomorrow. Doctor, Rambert said, I'm not going. I want to stay with you. Tarou made no movement. He went on driving. Rieux seemed unable to shake off his fatigue. And what about her? His voice was hardly audible. Rambert said he'd thought it over very carefully, and his views hadn't changed. But if he went away, he would feel ashamed of himself, and that would embarrass his relations with the woman he loved. Showing more animation, Rieux told him that was sheer nonsense. There was nothing shameful in preferring happiness. Certainly, Rambert replied, but it may be shameful to be happy by oneself. Tarou, who had not spoken so far, now remarked, without turning his head, that if Rambert wished to take a share in other people's unhappiness, he'd have no time left for happiness. So the choice had to be made. That's not it, Rambert rejoined. Until now, I always felt a stranger in this town, and that I'd no concern with you people. But now that I've seen what I have seen, I know that I belong here, whether I want it or not. This business is everybody's business. When there was no reply from either of the others, Rambert seemed to grow annoyed. But you know that as well as I do, damn it, or else what are you up to in that hospital of yours? Have you made a definite choice and turned down happiness? Ria and Taru still said nothing, and the silence lasted until they were nearing the doctor's home. Then Rambert repeated his last question in a yet more emphatic tone. Only then Ria turned towards him, raising himself with an effort from the cushion. "Forgive me, Rambert, only, well, I simply don't know. But stay with us if you want to." A swerve of the car made him break off for a moment. Then, looking straight in front of him, he said, "For nothing in the world is it worth turning one's back on what one loves. Yet that is what I'm doing, though why I do not know." He sank back on the cushion. "That's how it is," he added wearily, "and there's nothing to be done about it. So let's recognize the fact and draw the conclusions." "What conclusions?" "Ah," Ria said, "a man can't cure and know at the same time. So let's cure as quickly as we can. That's the more urgent job." At midnight, Taru and Ria were giving Rambert the map of the district he was to keep under surveillance. Taru glanced at his watch. Looking up, he met Rambert's gaze. "Have you let them know?" he asked. The journalist looked away. "I'd sent them a note," he spoke with an effort, "before coming to see you." It's chapter 3. Towards the close of October, Castel's anti-plague serum was tried for the first time. Practically speaking, it was Ria's last card. If it failed, the doctor was convinced the whole town would be at the mercy of the epidemic, which would either continue its ravages for an unpredictable period or perhaps die out abruptly of its own accord. That makes more sense. Die out abruptly of its own accord. The day before Castel called on Ria, Monsieur Ton's son had fallen ill, and all the family had to go into quarantine. Thus the mother, who had only recently come out of it, found herself notated once again, or isolated once again. It's a bad point. In deference to the official regulations, the magistrate had promptly sent for Dr. Ria the moment he saw symptoms of the disease in his little boy. Mother and father were standing at the bedside when Ria entered the room. The boy was in the phase of extreme prostration and submitted without a whimper to the doctor's examination. When Ria raised his eyes, he saw the magistrate's gaze intent on him, and behind the mother's pale face, she was holding a handkerchief in her mouth, or to her mouth. Holding a handkerchief to her mouth, and her big, dilated eyes followed each of the doctor's movements. "He has it, I suppose?" the magistrate asked in a toneless voice. "Yes." Ria gazed down at the child again. The mother's eyes widened yet more, but she still said nothing. Monsieur Ton, too, kept silent for a while before saying in an even lower tone, "Well, doctor, we must do as we are told to do." Ria avoided looking at Madame Auton, who was still holding her handkerchief to her mouth. "It needn't take long," he said rather awkwardly, "if you'll let me use your phone." The magistrate said he would take him to the telephone, but before going the doctor turned towards Madame Auton. "I regret very much indeed, but I'm afraid you'll have to get your things ready. You know how it is." Madame Auton seemed disconcerted. She was staring at the floor. Then, "I understand," she murmured, slowly nodding her head. "I'll set about it at once." Before leaving, Ria, on a sudden impulse, asked the Autons if there wasn't anything they'd like him to do for them. The mother gazed at him in silence, and now the magistrate averted his eyes. "No," he said, then swallowed hard. "But save my son." In the early days, a mere formality, quarantine had now been reorganized by Ria and Robert on very strict lines. In particular, they insisted on having members of the family of a patient kept apart. If unawares one of them had been infected, the risks of an extension of the infection must not be multiplied. Ria explained this to the magistrate, who signified his approval of the procedure. Nevertheless, he and his wife exchanged a glance which made it clear to Ria how keenly they both felt the separation thus imposed on them. Madame Mouton and her little girl could be given rooms in the quarantine hospital under Rambert's charge. For the magistrate, however, no accommodation was available except in an isolation camp the authorities were now installing in the municipal sports ground, using tents supplied by the Highways Department. When Ria apologized for the poor accommodations, Monsieur Auton replied that there was one rule for all alike, and it was only proper to abide by it. The boy was taken to the auxiliary hospital and put in a small ward, which had formerly been a junior classroom. After some 20 hours, Rieux became convinced that the case was hopeless. The infection was steadily spreading, and the boy's body putting up no resistance. Tiny, half-formed but acutely painful buboes were clogging the joints of the child's puny limbs. Obviously, it was a losing fight. Under the circumstances, Ria had no qualms about testing Castel's serum on the boy. That night, after dinner, they performed the inoculation, a lengthy process, without getting the slightest reaction. At daybreak on the following day, they gathered round the bed to observe the effects of this test inoculation on which so much hung. The child had come out of his extreme prostration and was tossing about convulsively on the bed. From 4 in the morning, Dr. Castel and Theroux had been keeping watch and noting stage by stage the progress and remissions of the malady. Theroux's bulky form was slightly drooping at the head of the bed, while at its foot, with Ria standing beside him, Castel was seated, reading with every appearance of calm an old leather-bound book. One by one, as the light increased in the former classroom, the others arrived. Paneloux, the first to come, leant against the wall on the opposite side of the bed to Theroux. His face was drawn with grief, and the accumulated weariness of many weeks, during which he had never spared himself, had deeply seamed his somewhat prominent forehead. Grand came next. It was 7 o'clock, and he apologized for being out of breath. He could only stay a moment, but wanted to know if any definite results had been observed. Without speaking, Ria pointed to the child. His eyes shut, his teeth clenched, his features frozen in an agonized grimace. He was rolling his head from side to side on the bolster. When there was just light enough to make out the half-obliterated figures of an equation chalked on a blackboard that was still hung on the wall at the far end of the room, Rambert entered. Posting himself at the foot of the next bed, he took a packet of cigarettes from his pocket, but after his first glance at the child's face, he put it back. From his chair, Castel looked at Ria over his spectacles. Any news of his father? No. He's in the isolation camp. The doctor's hands were gripping the rail of the bed, his eyes fixed on the small, tortured body. Suddenly it stiffened and seemed to give a little at the waist, as slowly the arms and legs spread out X-wise. From the body, naked under an army blanket, rose a smell of damp wool and stale sweat. The boy had gritted his teeth again. Then, very gradually, he relaxed, bringing his arms and legs back towards the center of the bed, still without speaking or opening his eyes, and his breathing seemed to quicken. Ria looked at Theroux, who hastily lowered his eyes. They had already seen children die. For many months now, death had shown no favoritism. They had never yet watched a child's agony, minute by minute, as they had now been doing since daybreak. Needless to say, the pain inflicted on these innocent victims had always seemed to them to be what in fact it was, an abominable thing. But hitherto they had felt its abomination in, so to speak, an abstract way. They had never had to witness over so long a period the death throes of an innocent child. And just then, the boy had a sudden spasm, as if something had bitten him in the stomach, and uttered a long, shrill wail. For moments that seemed endless, he stayed in a queer, contorted position, his body racked by convulsive tremors. It was as if his frail frame were bending before the fierce breath of the plague, breaking under the reiterated gusts of fever. Then the storm wind passed. There came a lull, and he relaxed a little. The fever seemed to recede, leaving him gasping for breath on a dank, pestilential shore, lost in a languor that already looked like death. When for the third time the fiery wave broke on him, lifting him a little, the child curled himself up and shrank away to the edge of the bed, as if in terror of the flames advancing on him, licking his limbs. A moment later, after tossing his head wildly to and fro, he flung off the blanket. From between the inflamed eyelids, big tears welled up and trickled down the sunken, leaden-hued cheeks. When the spasm had passed, utterly exhausted, tensing his thin legs and arms, on which within 48 hours the flesh had wasted to the bone, the child lay flat, racked on the tumbled bed, in a grotesque parody of crucifixion. Bending, Taru gently stroked with his big paw the small face stained with tears and sweat. Castell had closed his book a few moments before, and his eyes were now fixed on the child. He began to speak, but had to give a cough before continuing because his voice rang out so harshly. There wasn't any remission this morning, was there, Rhea? Rhea shook his head, adding, however, that the child was putting up more resistance than one would have expected. Panalu, who was slumped against the wall, said in a low voice, "So, if he has to die, he will have suffered longer." Light was increasing in the ward. The occupants of the other beds were tossing about and groaning, but in tones that seemed deliberately subdued. Only one at the far end of the ward was screaming, or rather uttering little exclamations at regular intervals, which seemed to convey surprise more than pain. Indeed, one had the impression that even for the sufferers, the frantic terror of the early phase had passed, and there was a sort of mournful resignation in their present attitude towards the disease. Only the child went on fighting with all his little might. Now and again Rhea took his pulse, less because it served any purpose than as an escape from his utter helplessness. And when he closed his eyes, he seemed to feel its tumult mingling with the fever of his own blood. And then, at one with the tortured child, he struggled to sustain him with all the remaining strength of his own body. But, linked for a few moments, the rhythms of their heartbeats soon fell apart. The child escaped him, and again he knew his impotence. Then he released the small, thin wrist and moved back to his place. The light on the whitewashed walls was changing from pink to yellow. The first waves of another day of heat were beating on the windows. They hardly heard Grand saying he would come back as he turned to go. All were waiting. The child, his eyes still closed, seemed to grow a little calmer. His claw-like fingers were feebly plucking at the sides of the bed. Then they rose, scratched at the blanket over his knees, and suddenly he doubled up his limbs, bringing his thighs above his stomach, and remained quite still. For the first time he opened his eyes and gazed at Rhea, who was standing immediately in front of him. In the small face, rigid as a mask of grayish clay, slowly the lips parted, and from them rose a long, incessant scream, hardly varying with his respiration, and filling the ward with a fierce, indignant protest, so little childish that it seemed like a collective voice issuing from all the sufferers there. Rhea clenched his jaws. Taru looked away. Rambert went and stood beside Castell, whose closed book was lying on his knees. Panalu gazed down at the small mouth, fouled with the sores of the plague, and pouring out the angry death cry that has sounded through the ages of mankind. He sank onto his knees, and all present found it natural to hear him say in a voice hoarse but clearly audible across that nameless, never-ending wail. My God, spare this child. But the wail continued without cease, and the other sufferers began to grow restless. The patient at the far end of the ward, whose little broken cries had gone on without a break, now quickened their tempo so that they flowed together in one unbroken cry, while the other's groans grew louder. A gust of sobs swept through the room, drowning Panalu's prayer, and Rhea, who was still tightly gripping the rail of the bed, shut his eyes, dazed with exhaustion and disgust. When he opened them again, Taru was at his side. I must go, Rhea said. I can't bear to hear them any more. Then again the other sufferers fell silent. And now the doctor grew aware that the child's wail, after weakening more and more, had fluttered out into silence. Round him the groans began again, but more faintly, like a far echo of the fight that was now over. For it was over. Castell had moved round to the other side of the bed and said the end had come. His mouth still gaping, but silent now. The child was lying amongst the tumbled blankets, a small, shrunken form, with the tears still wet on his cheeks. Panalu went up to the bed and made the sign of benediction. Then, gathering up his cassock, he walked out by the passage between the beds. Will you have to start it all over again? Taru asked Castell. The old doctor nodded slowly, with a twisted smile. Perhaps. After all, he put up a surprisingly long resistance. Rhea was already on his way out, walking so quickly and with such a strange look on his face that Panalu put out an arm to check him when he was about to pass him in the doorway. Come, doctor, he began. Rhea swung round on him fiercely. Oh, that child, anyhow, was innocent, and you know it as well as I do. He strode on, brushing past Panalu, and walked across the school playground. Sitting on a wooden bench under the dingy, stunted trees, he wiped off the sweat which was beginning to run into his eyes. He felt like shouting imprecations, anything to loosen the stranglehold lashing his heart with steel. Heat was flooding down between the branches of the fig trees. A white haze spreading rapidly over the blue of the morning sky made the air yet more stifling. Rhea lay back wearily on the bench. Gazing up at the ragged branches, the shimmering sky, he slowly got back his breath and fought down his fatigue. He heard a voice behind him. Why was there that anger in your voice just now? What we'd been seeing was as unbearable to me as it was to you. Rhea turned toward Panalu. I know. I'm sorry. But weariness is a kind of madness. And there are times when the only feeling I have is one of mad revolt. I understand, Panalu said in a low voice. That sort of thing is revolting because it passes our human understanding. But perhaps we should love what we cannot understand. Rhea straightened up slowly. He gazed at Panalu, summoning to his gaze all the strength and fervor he could muster against his weariness. Then he shook his head. No, father, I've a very different idea of love. And until my dying day I shall refuse to love a scheme of things in which children are put to torture. A shade of disquietude crossed the priest's face. He was silent for a moment. Then, doctor, he said sadly, I've just realized what is meant by grace. Rhea had sunk back again on the bench. His lassitude had returned, and from its depths he spoke more gently. It's something I haven't got, that I know, but I'd rather not discuss that with you. We're working side by side for something that unites us, beyond blasphemy and prayers, and it's the only thing that matters. Panalu sat down beside Rhea. It was obvious that he was deeply moved. Yes, he said, you too are working for man's salvation. Rhea tried to smile. Salvation's much too big a word for me. I don't aim so high. I'm concerned with man's health. And for me, his health comes first. Panaloo seemed to hesitate. Doctor, he began, then fell silent. Down his face, too, sweat was trickling. Murmuring goodbye for the present, he rose. His eyes were moist. When he turned to go, Rhea, who had seemed lost in thought, suddenly rose and took a step towards him. Again, please forgive me. I can promise there won't be another outburst of that kind. Panaloo held out his hand, saying regretfully, and yet, I haven't convinced you. What does it matter? What I hate is death and disease, as you well know, and whether you wish it or not, we're allies, facing them and fighting them together. Rhea was still holding Panaloo's hand. So you see, but he refrained from meeting the priest's eyes. God himself can't part us now.